The explosions ripped through the heart of Nazi Germany's propaganda machine, just as Joseph Goebbels was declaring the Reich's invincibility to millions of listeners. Radio broadcasts across the nation suddenly went silent, replaced by the terrifying reality that British bombers had somehow penetrated the supposedly impenetrable defenses of Berlin in broad daylight during one of the most important Nazi celebrations of the year. Hermann Göring's face turned ashen as he realized that a handful of wooden British aircraft had just humiliated the entire Luftwaffe and shattered the illusion that the German capital was beyond enemy reach. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year 1943 marked a turning point in the Second World War, though few could have predicted that this pivotal moment would arrive courtesy of an aircraft that many German leaders had dismissed as nothing more than craft. An annoying gnat. The de Havilland Mosquito, constructed primarily of wood and powered by twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, represented everything the traditional military establishment thought was wrong with modern aviation design. Where other bombers relied on heavy armor and defensive guns, the Mosquito depended entirely on speed and agility. Where conventional wisdom demanded metal construction, Geoffrey de Havilland had chosen wood, earning his creation the nickname, the Wooden Wonder. The aircraft's genesis lay in the brilliant mind of de Havilland, who had observed that the fastest way to avoid being shot down was simply to be too fast to catch. His radical design philosophy stripped away everything unnecessary, creating a sleek, twin-engine aircraft that could outrun most German fighters while carrying either bombs for attack missions or cameras for reconnaissance work. The Mosquito's wooden construction, far from being a weakness, proved to be one of its greatest strengths. Wood was lighter than metal, easier to work with using traditional carpentry techniques, and surprisingly resilient to battle damage. More importantly, it didn't show up clearly on German radar systems, which were calibrated to detect metal aircraft. By early 1943, Mosquito squadrons had been conducting increasingly daring raids across occupied Europe, but none had attempted anything as audacious as a daylight bombing attack on Berlin itself. The German capital remained one of the most heavily defended cities in the world, ringed by anti-aircraft guns, protected by fighter squadrons, and considered absolutely safe from Allied bombing during daylight hours. The Luftwaffe's leadership, particularly Hermann Göring, had repeatedly promised the German people that enemy bombs would never fall on Berlin, and so far, that promise had held true during daylight operations. Squadron Leader Charles Pickard, a veteran pilot with nerves of steel and an almost supernatural ability to navigate through the most dangerous airspace in Europe, received his briefing on the morning of January 29, 1943. The mission parameters seemed almost impossible. Lead a formation of Mosquitoes deep into German airspace, penetrate Berlin's defenses in broad daylight, and drop bombs on specific targets during the Nazi Party's most important propaganda celebration of the year. The timing was no coincidence. January 30th marked the 10th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's rise to power, and the Nazi propaganda machine had planned a full day of speeches and radio broadcasts designed to reinforce the regime's image of invincibility. Pickard studied the intelligence reports with characteristic calm, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the proposed flight path. The route would take his formation across the North Sea, over occupied Holland, across northern Germany, and directly into the heart of the Reich. They would be flying without fighter escort, relying entirely on the Mosquito's speed to evade interception. The weather forecast called for scattered clouds, which could provide some concealment, but also made navigation more challenging. Most critically, they would need to time their arrival over Berlin to coincide exactly with the propaganda broadcasts, maximizing the psychological impact of their attack. The selected crews represented the cream of the Royal Air Force's Mosquito squadrons. Each pilot and navigator had been chosen not just for their technical skill, but for their proven ability to remain cool under extreme pressure. They understood that this mission was about more than just dropping bombs on buildings. It was about striking at the very heart of Nazi morale and demonstrating that nowhere in Hitler's empire was truly safe from Allied attack. The psychological warfare aspect was as important as any physical damage they might cause. As dawn broke over the English countryside on January 30th, ground crews worked feverishly to prepare the Mosquitos for their historic mission. Each aircraft was loaded with a carefully calculated bomb load, enough explosive power to cause significant damage, but not so much weight as to compromise the speed that was their primary defense. The bombs themselves had been specially selected for maximum psychological impact, chosen more for their ability to create spectacular explosions than for their destructive power against hardened targets. Pickard conducted his final briefing with quiet authority, reviewing navigation checkpoints, emergency procedures, and the precise timing that would be crucial to the mission's success. He emphasized that maintaining formation integrity would be essential during a long flight across enemy territory, but that individual initiative might be required once they reached the target area. The German defenses around Berlin were formidable and unpredictable, and each crew would need to make split-second decisions about their attack approach based on the tactical situation they encountered. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines roared to life with their characteristic deep-throated growl, sending vibrations through the wooden airframes as the Mosquitos prepared for takeoff. Pickard advanced his throttles smoothly, feeling the surge of power as his aircraft accelerated down the runway. Behind him, the rest of the formation followed in precise intervals, each pilot focused on the delicate balance of power and control required to get their heavily loaded aircraft airborne. The flight across the North Sea passed without incident, the formation maintaining radio silence as they climbed to their cruising altitude. Below them, the gray waters stretched endlessly toward the European coast, while above, scattered clouds provided occasional concealment from searching eyes. Pickard constantly scanned his instruments and the sky around him, knowing that German radar stations along the Dutch coast would soon detect their approach. As they crossed into occupied airspace, the tension aboard each aircraft became palpable. Navigator Gerald Henderson, flying with Pickard, bent over his charts and instruments, calculating wind drift and updating their estimated time of arrival over Berlin. Every minute counted now, because their entire plan depended on arriving over the target just as the Nazi propaganda broadcasts reached their climactic moments. The German early warning system had indeed detected the incoming formation, but confusion reigned in the Luftwaffe command centers. The radar signatures were faint and intermittent, suggesting a small number of aircraft that appeared to be flying at unusually high speed. Some controllers dismissed the contacts as equipment malfunctions or migrating birds, while others recognized the potential threat but struggled to coordinate an effective response. The wooden construction of the Mosquitos was already paying dividends, creating uncertainty and delay in the German defensive reaction. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons scrambled from bases across northern Germany, but they faced the nearly impossible task of intercepting aircraft whose exact position and intended target remained unclear. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters that rose to meet the threat were formidable opponents, but they had been designed primarily for dogfighting rather than high-speed Hellbillah. Interception missions. Their pilots found themselves chasing radar ghosts and radio reports that seemed to place the enemy bombers in multiple locations simultaneously. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Nazi propaganda machine was orchestrating one of its most important events of the year. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's master propagandist, had prepared a stirring speech designed to reinforce German morale and demonstrate the Reich's continued strength. Radio technicians made final adjustments to ensure that his words would reach every corner of Germany and the occupied territories. The broadcast studios hummed with activity as announcers prepared to introduce the various speakers and ceremonies planned for the day. Goebbels himself was in excellent form, his sharp mind focused on the political message he wanted to convey. The war had not been going entirely according to plan, with the disaster at Stalingrad still fresh in German minds, but the propaganda minister was determined to reshape the narrative and restore confidence in the ultimate victory. His speech would emphasize the Reich's technological superiority, the invincibility of German defenses, and the futility of Allied bombing campaigns against the German homeland. High above northern Germany, Pickard's formation continued its relentless approach toward Berlin. The Mosquitos were now deep in enemy territory, flying at maximum cruising speed to minimize their exposure time. Each crew member remained focused on his instruments and responsibilities, but all were acutely aware that they were approaching the most dangerous phase of their mission. Berlin's air defenses represented the most concentrated anti-aircraft firepower in the world, and they would soon be flying directly into the teeth of that defensive network. The German capital sprawled beneath layers of industrial haze and scattered clouds as the Mosquitos approached their target area. Navigator Henderson made final course corrections based on visual landmarks and radio navigation aids, while Pickard prepared for the complex maneuvers that would be required to deliver their bombs accurately. While evading defensive fire, the other aircraft in the formation spread out slightly to complicate the German gunner's task, each pilot ready to begin his individual attack run on command. At precisely 11:30 in the morning, as Goebbels reached the crescendo of his speech about German invincibility, the first Mosquito bombs exploded in Berlin. The detonations were not particularly large in terms of pure destructive power, but their psychological impact was devastating. Radio broadcasts across Germany were suddenly interrupted by the sound of explosions and air raid sirens, followed by dead silence as transmission equipment was damaged and announcers fled their studios in Place. Confusion. Goebbels himself was mid-sentence when the building shook from a nearby explosion. His confident words about German air superiority rendered suddenly hollow by the reality of British bombs falling on the capital. The propaganda minister's carefully crafted message of invincibility was replaced by the unmistakable sound of enemy action in the heart of the Reich. Broadcast live to millions of German listeners who had been assured that such a thing was impossible. The Mosquitos swept through Berlin's airspace like phantoms, their wooden construction and high speed making them difficult targets for the anti-aircraft guns that now opened up across the city. Pickard led his formation through a complex series of evasive maneuvers, climbing and diving to throw off the German gunner's aim, while his navigator called out landmarks and bombing targets. The experience was surreal, flying in broad daylight over one of the most heavily defended cities in Europe, while German fighters scrambled desperately to intercept them. German flak batteries filled the sky with black puffs of exploding shells, but the Mosquitoes' speed made them extremely difficult targets. The anti-aircraft guns had been positioned and calibrated for slower, heavier bombers flying in large formations, not for small numbers of high-speed aircraft making individual attack runs. Pickard felt his aircraft shudder as shrapnel rattled against the wooden fuselage, but the Mosquitoes' resilient construction absorbed the damage without compromising flight performance. Below them, Berlin erupted into chaos as air raid sirens wailed, and citizens who had grown complacent about daylight safety suddenly found themselves diving for shelter. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical damage, as ordinary Germans realized that their supposedly impregnable capital was not safe from enemy attack even in broad daylight. The myth of invincibility that the Nazi regime had carefully cultivated was cracking under the impact of British bombs. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most powerful subordinates, was preparing for his own speech when the bombing began. The man who had famously promised that no enemy bombs would ever fall on German soil was confronted with the humiliating reality that a handful of wooden British aircraft had penetrated his defenses with apparent ease. His carefully prepared remarks about Luftwaffe superiority suddenly seemed like hollow boasts in the face of enemy action over Berlin. The Reichsmarschall's rage was legendary, but on this occasion, his fury was tempered by a growing sense of professional embarrassment. Göring understood military aviation better than most of the Nazi leadership, and he recognized immediately that the British had achieved something remarkable. The fact that Mosquitos had reached Berlin in daylight represented a fundamental failure of German air defense doctrine, and he knew that explanations would be demanded from the very highest levels of the regime. As the last bombs fell and the Mosquitos turned for home, German fighter pilots finally managed to position themselves for intercept attempts. Several Messerschmitt 109s dove on the retreating British formation, their pilots eager to salvage something from what was already shaping up as a humiliating failure of German air defenses. However, the Mosquito's speed advantage proved decisive in these encounters as well. The German fighters, designed for dogfighting rather than high-speed pursuit, found themselves unable to close the distance effectively. Pilot Officer Robert Davidson, flying as Pickard's wingman, found himself pursued by 2 German fighters as the formation began its withdrawal from Berlin. The Messerschmitts had gained altitude advantage and were diving on his aircraft with guns blazing, but Davidson's Mosquito responded to his control inputs with the agility that made the type so effective. He threw his aircraft into a steep climbing turn that the heavier German fighters couldn't match, then used his speed advantage to open the distance and escape toward the relative safety of the formation. The flight home proved less eventful than the approach, though tension remained high as the Mosquitoes crossed back over German-occupied territory. Luftwaffe fighters continued to pursue them intermittently, but the British aircraft maintained their speed advantage and used cloud cover effectively to break contact. By mid-afternoon, all the aircraft had safely crossed the North Sea and were approaching their home bases in England. Ground crews rushed to inspect the returning Mosquitoes for battle damage, finding evidence of the intense flak that had filled Berlin's skies, but marveling at how well the wooden aircraft had withstood the punishment. Several aircraft showed shrapnel holes and minor structural damage, but none had suffered anything approaching critical failure. The Mosquito's reputation for resilience was further enhanced by its performance over one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Pickard's mission debriefing revealed the full scope of what had been accomplished. Intelligence reports soon confirmed that German radio broadcasts had been disrupted at precisely the moment when Nazi propagandists were proclaiming the invincibility of German air defenses. The psychological impact of the raid extended far beyond any physical damage caused by the bombs themselves. For the first time, ordinary Germans had concrete evidence that their capital was not safe from Allied attack, even during daylight hours. The German response was swift, but revealed the depth of their embarrassment. Göring convened emergency meetings with his staff to analyze how British bombers had penetrated Berlin's defenses so easily. The Luftwaffe commander was particularly frustrated by the performance of his early warning system, which had provided inadequate notice of the approaching threat. The wooden construction of the Mosquitoes had clearly compromised German radar effectiveness, but Göring was reluctant to admit that British engineering had outsmarted German technology. Private conversations among Nazi leadership revealed the true extent of their concern about the raid's implications. Hitler himself was reportedly furious about the failure of air defenses that he had been assured were impregnable, while Goebbels struggled to craft a propaganda response that could minimize the psychological damage. The fact that British bombs had fallen on Berlin during a celebration of Nazi power created a narrative problem that even the regime's skilled propagandists found difficult to resolve. German technical experts began intensive studies of Mosquito capabilities and tactics, trying to understand how the British had achieved their success. Luftwaffe intelligence had underestimated both the aircraft's performance and the skill of RAF crews in employing it effectively. The wooden construction that German engineers had initially dismissed as primitive was now recognized as a sophisticated solution to the problem of radar detection. Finer tactics were also revised in response to the Mosquito threat, with emphasis placed on high-altitude interception and improved coordination between radar stations and fighter squadrons. However, these defensive improvements would take time to implement, and meanwhile, the British had demonstrated that they possessed both the technology and the operational capability to strike at the heart of the Reich when and BN, where they chose. The success of the Berlin raid had immediate implications for future Mosquito operations. RAF leadership recognized that they had found an effective method for conducting precision strikes against high-value targets while minimizing losses. The psychological warfare aspect was particularly valuable. As these daylight raids undermined German civilian morale more effectively than nighttime bombing campaigns that most citizens experienced only as distant sounds and morning damage assessments. British intelligence monitored German communications carefully in the weeks following the raid, noting increased anxiety among both military and civilian populations about daylight air defense. The myth of German air superiority, already weakened by mounting Allied successes in other theaters, suffered another significant blow as citizens began to question official assurances about their safety from air attack. International reaction to the Berlin raid was overwhelmingly positive among Allied nations and neutral observers. The demonstration that British forces could strike at will against the German capital provided a powerful symbol of changing momentum in the European war. Resistance movements in occupied countries drew inspiration from evidence that the Reich's defenses were not as impregnable as Nazi propaganda claimed. The technical lessons learned from the Berlin operation influenced Mosquito development and employment for the remainder of the war. Engineers refined the aircraft's design to maximize its speed and stealth advantages, while operational planners developed increasingly sophisticated tactics for employing small formations of high-performance aircraft against heavily defended targets. Training programs for Mosquito crews were enhanced based on combat experience over Berlin, with emphasis placed on navigation accuracy, formation discipline, and evasive maneuvering in heavily defended airspace. The success of Pickard's mission demonstrated that properly trained crews could accomplish missions that would be impossible for conventional bomber formations, opening new possibilities for strategic air operations. The psychological dimension of the Berlin raid continued to resonate throughout 1943 and beyond. German propaganda efforts to minimize the significance of British daylight bombing became increasingly desperate as Mosquito raids continued and expanded. The contrast between Nazi claims of invincibility and the reality of British bombs falling on German cities created credibility problems that undermined broader propaganda efforts. Hermann Göring's personal reputation never fully recovered from the humiliation of the Berlin raid. The Luftwaffe commander, who had promised that no enemy bombs would fall on German soil, found himself increasingly marginalized within Nazi leadership as the reality of Allied air superiority became impossible to deny. His later admission that a handful of British wooden planes had made a mockery of German air defenses revealed the depth of professional embarrassment felt by senior Luftwaffe officers. The broader strategic implications of the Mosquito's success over Berlin extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. The demonstration that speed and precision could achieve results that massive bombing formations could not accomplish influenced Allied strategic thinking throughout the remainder of the war. Resources that might otherwise have been devoted to building more heavy bombers were instead allocated to developing and producing additional high-performance aircraft like the Mosquito. German defensive strategy was also forced to adapt to the new threat posed by high-speed, low-signature aircraft operating in small formations. Anti-aircraft gun positions had to be recalibrated for different types of targets, while fighter squadrons required new tactics and training to engage effectively with aircraft that could outrun most German interceptors. The wood construction that had initially been seen as a liability became recognized as one of the Mosquito's greatest advantages. German radar technology of the 1940s was optimized for detecting metal aircraft, and the wooden Mosquito's reduced radar signature gave it a stealth capability that wouldn't be fully understood or be replicated until decades later. Post-war analysis revealed the full extent to which the Berlin raid had achieved its objectives. German intelligence documents captured after the war showed the depth of concern within Nazi leadership about the implications of British daylight bombing capabilities. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was documented in propaganda ministry reports that revealed growing anxiety about air defense effectiveness. The success of Squadron Leader Pickard and his crews in penetrating Berlin's defenses represented more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated a fundamental shift in the balance of air power over Europe. The ability to strike at the heart of the Reich with precision and impunity marked the beginning of the end for German air superiority, even though the full implications wouldn't become apparent until much later in the war. The de Havilland Mosquito's wooden construction, twin Merlin engines, and innovative design philosophy had combined to create an aircraft that could accomplish missions impossible for conventional bombers. The Berlin raid of January 30, 1943, stands as perhaps the finest example of how superior technology, skilled crews, and innovative tactics could achieve strategic objectives that raw firepower alone could not accomplish. For the German people listening to their radios that morning, the sudden interruption of their propaganda broadcasts by the sound of British bombs represented a profound psychological shock. The illusion that their capital was safe from enemy attack was shattered permanently, and with it, much of their confidence in Nazi promises about ultimate victory. The Mosquito had proven that in warfare, as in many aspects of life, speed, precision, and daring could triumph over brute force and traditional defenses. The legacy of that remarkable day would influence aviation development and military strategy for generations to come. But for the men who flew those wooden aircraft through the flak-filled skies over Berlin, it was simply another mission successfully completed in service of their country and the cause of freedom. The immediate aftermath of the Berlin raid saw frantic activity in German command centers across the Reich. Field Marshal Hugo Sperl, commanding Luftwaffe III in Western Europe, found himself facing uncomfortable questions from Berlin about how British aircraft had penetrated so deeply into German airspace without effective interception. The aging Luftwaffe veteran, who had cut his teeth during the Spanish Civil War, recognized that the air war was entering a new phase that would challenge everything the German Air Force thought it knew about WWII operations. Sperl's headquarters received a stream of angry telephone calls from Göring's staff, demanding explanations for the defensive failure. The Reichsmarshal's fury was legendary throughout the Luftwaffe, but this time his rage was tempered by genuine professional concern. The implications of the Mosquito raid extended far beyond simple embarrassment. They suggested fundamental weaknesses in German air defense doctrine that could be exploited by increasingly sophisticated Allied air operations. At RAF headquarters in London, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris was studying intelligence reports about the Berlin raid's impact with considerable satisfaction. The commander of RAF Bomber Command had initially been skeptical about precision daylight operations, preferring the massive nighttime bombing campaigns that were his specialty. However, the success of Pickard's mission forced him to reconsider the potential value of small-scale, high-speed operations against critical targets. Harris summoned his senior staff officers to discuss the implications of the Mosquito's performance over Berlin. Group Captain Sidney Bufton, his deputy director of bomber operations, presented a comprehensive analysis of German defensive reactions to the raid. The intelligence indicated that Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were being reorganized to provide better coverage against high-speed intruders, but these changes would take months to implement effectively. The success of the Berlin operation also attracted attention from the highest levels of British government. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, always fascinated by innovative military technologies and daring operations, requested detailed briefings about the Mosquito's capabilities and future potential. The Prime Minister's scientific advisor, Professor Frederick Lindemann, provided technical analysis that emphasized the aircraft's unique combination of speed, stealth, and versatility. Churchill's enthusiasm for the Mosquito program was infectious, and his support helped secure additional resources for aircraft production and crew training. The Prime Minister understood instinctively that the psychological warfare aspect of these daylight raids could be as valuable as their direct military impact. The ability to strike at German morale while demonstrating British technological superiority aligned perfectly with his broader strategic vision. Meanwhile, in occupied Europe, resistance movements were already beginning to draw inspiration from news of the Berlin raid. Underground newspapers in France, Holland, and Belgium featured accounts of British bombs falling on the German capital, often embellishing the details to maximize their propaganda value. The psychological impact rippled outward from Berlin, through the entire German-controlled territory, undermining Nazi claims of invincibility. The French resistance, operating under increasingly difficult conditions as German security measures intensified, found particular encouragement in evidence that the Reich's defenses could be penetrated. Pierre Brossolette, a key figure in the French intelligence networks, noted in his coded communications to London that German occupation forces seemed noticeably more nervous after news of the Berlin bombing reached France. Back in Germany, civilian reaction to the raid was more complex than simple fear or demoralization. While Nazi propaganda tried to minimize the significance of the attack, ordinary Germans were sophisticated enough to recognize that something significant had changed. The fact that British bombers had reached Berlin in daylight represented a fundamental shift in the war's trajectory that no amount of propaganda could completely obscure. Dr. Joseph Goebbels faced the challenging task of crafting a response that would minimize the psychological damage while maintaining credibility with an increasingly skeptical German population. The propaganda minister's initial instinct was to dismiss the raid as a minor nuisance, but intelligence reports from his own ministry indicated that German morale had been genuinely affected by the demonstration of British bombing capability. Goebbels convened emergency meetings with his senior propaganda staff to develop a comprehensive response strategy. The challenge was to acknowledge the reality of the attack, while somehow turning it into a propaganda advantage for the Nazi regime. After hours of discussion, they settled on a narrative that portrayed the raid as a desperate act by a failing British war effort, emphasizing the minimal physical damage while ignoring the psychological implications. The propaganda response revealed the depth of Nazi concern about the raid's impact. Newspapers across Germany carried carefully crafted articles that minimized British bombing effectiveness while promising enhanced air defenses. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with Luftwaffe pilots who claimed that German fighters had driven off the attackers, though these accounts contradicted the obvious fact that all the Mosquitos had returned safely to Bur, England. German technical experts were meanwhile conducting detailed analyses of the Mosquito threat, trying to understand how British engineers had created such an effective aircraft using what they had initially dismissed as primitive materials. The wooden construction that German designers had scorned was now recognized as a sophisticated solution to multiple technical challenges, from weight reduction to radar signature minimization. Professor Ernst Heinkel, one of Germany's most respected aircraft designers, submitted a confidential report to the Air Ministry analyzing the Mosquito's technical innovations. Heinkel's assessment was brutally honest about German shortcomings in aircraft design philosophy, particularly the tendency to prioritize raw performance over operational effectiveness. The Mosquito represented a different approach to aviation engineering that integrated speed, stealth, and versatility in ways that German designers had not anticipated. The Heinkel report sparked intense debates within German aviation circles about the fundamental principles of aircraft design. Traditional German approaches emphasized heavily armed, wheel-armored aircraft that could survive in combat through superior firepower and protection. The Mosquito demonstrated that survivability could also be achieved through speed and stealth, avoiding combat rather than winning it through superior weaponry. These philosophical differences reflected broader contrasts between German and British approaches to technological development during the war. German engineering tended toward complexity and specialization, creating aircraft optimized for specific roles but lacking versatility. British design philosophy, exemplified by the Mosquito, emphasized adaptability and multi-role capability, creating aircraft that could excel in various missions. The impact of the Berlin raid extended beyond immediate military considerations to influence broader strategic thinking on both sides. For the British, the success validated their investment in precision bombing capabilities and encouraged further development of similar aircraft and tactics. For the Germans, the raid highlighted vulnerabilities in their defensive strategy that would require fundamental changes in resource allocation and operational doctrine. Luftwaffe training programs were rapidly modified to address the Mosquito threat, with emphasis placed on high-altitude interception techniques and improved radar-guided fighter operations. However, these changes highlighted resource constraints that were becoming increasingly severe as the war progressed. German industry was already struggling to produce sufficient quantities of conventional aircraft, and the need to develop new interceptor capabilities diverted resources from other critical areas. The success of the Mosquito over Berlin also influenced American strategic bombing doctrine, though initially in subtle ways. The United States Army Air Forces had committed heavily to daylight precision bombing, using heavily armed bombers flying in large formations. The British demonstration that small numbers of high-speed aircraft could achieve significant results challenged some fundamental assumptions about strategic bombing effectiveness. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force in England, was particularly intrigued by the Mosquito's performance and began investigating whether similar tactics could be employed using American aircraft. However, the U.S. aircraft industry was already committed to mass production of heavy bombers, and changing strategic direction would have required enormous shifts in manufacturing priorities and crew training programs. The technical lessons from the Berlin raid also influenced ongoing aircraft development programs on both sides of the Atlantic. British engineers began studying ways to incorporate Mosquito design principles into other aircraft types, while American designers examined whether similar performance could be achieved using different, quote, materials and construction techniques. De Havilland's engineering team, led by Geoffrey de Havilland himself, was already working on improved versions of the Mosquito that would incorporate lessons learned from combat operations. The Berlin raid provided valuable data about aircraft performance under extreme combat conditions, particularly regarding structural resilience and engine reliability during high-stress operations. The success over Berlin also validated the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine's exceptional performance characteristics under combat conditions. The twin Merlins that powered the Mosquito had operated flawlessly during the long flight to Berlin and back, maintaining full power even when subjected to the stress of combat maneuvering. This performance data influenced ongoing engine development programs and reinforced British confidence in their power plant technology. German engine manufacturers, meanwhile, struggled to match the Merlin's combination of power, reliability, and fuel efficiency. The Daimler-Benz and BMW engines that powered German fighters were powerful, but consumed fuel at higher rates and required more frequent maintenance. These technical disadvantages became increasingly critical as German fuel supplies tightened and maintenance resources became scarce. The strategic implications of the Berlin raid continued to unfold throughout the spring and summer of 1943. British intelligence monitored German communications carefully, noting increased anxiety among both military and civilian populations about daylight air defense capabilities. The psychological impact of the raid proved to have longer-lasting effects than the physical damage caused by the bombs themselves. German defensive preparations revealed the depth of concern about future Mosquito operations. Anti-aircraft gun positions around Berlin were reinforced and recalibrated for high-speed targets, while fighter squadrons received additional training in interception techniques. However, these defensive improvements required months to implement effectively, and meanwhile, the British were developing increasingly sophisticated tactics for employing their high-speed bombers. The Berlin raid also influenced German intelligence priorities, with increased resources devoted to understanding British aircraft development and operational capabilities. Luftwaffe intelligence officers conducted detailed studies of captured Mosquito components and interrogated British aircrew who had been shot down on other missions, trying to piece together a complete picture of the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. These intelligence efforts revealed the remarkable extent to which British aircraft manufacturers had achieved their design objectives. The Mosquito represented a successful integration of multiple advanced technologies, from aerodynamics and structures to engines and avionics. German intelligence analysts grudgingly acknowledged that British engineers had created something genuinely innovative rather than simply copying existing designs. The success of the Berlin operation also had important implications for British aircraft production priorities. The Mosquito's proven effectiveness in combat led to increased production orders, though the aircraft's complex wooden construction limited manufacturing rates compared to more conventional metal aircraft. De Havilland's factories worked to expand production capacity while maintaining the precise craftsmanship required for the aircraft's wooden components. British aircraft production during World War II represented a remarkable achievement in industrial organization and technological innovation. The decision to build the Mosquito from wood rather than strategic metals proved prescient as raw material shortages became increasingly severe. The aircraft industry's ability to adapt to resource constraints while maintaining production quality demonstrated the flexibility and ingenuity of British manufacturing. The psychological warfare aspects of the Berlin raid continued to resonate throughout occupied Europe as news of the attack spread through underground networks and Allied propaganda broadcasts. The demonstration that British forces could strike at the heart of the Reich provided hope to resistance movements while undermining German occupation authority in subtle but significant ways. French resistance leader Jean Moulin noted in his communications with London that German occupation forces seemed noticeably more defensive after news of the Berlin bombing reached France. The psychological impact of demonstrating German vulnerability had effects that extended far beyond the immediate military value of the raid itself. Similar reactions were observed throughout occupied Europe as resistance movements drew inspiration from evidence that the Reich's defenses were not impregnable. Underground newspapers featured accounts of the Berlin raid, often embellishing details to maximize propaganda value while maintaining enough accuracy to retain credibility with increasingly sophisticated readers. The German response to these underground propaganda efforts revealed their concern about the raid's psychological impact. Security forces launched intensified campaigns against resistance networks, while propaganda ministries worked to counter Allied narratives about German defensive failures. However, these efforts often had the unintended effect of drawing additional attention to the very events they were trying to minimize. By summer 1943, the full implications of the Berlin raid were becoming apparent to strategic planners on both sides. The British had demonstrated a new capability that could strike at German morale and military effectiveness simultaneously. While the Germans were forced to confront fundamental weaknesses in their defensive strategy and aircraft development priorities, Air Chief Marshal Harris began planning follow-up operations that would exploit the Mosquito's proven capabilities while building on the psychological impact of the Berlin raid. These operations would combine precision bombing with propaganda objectives, targeting facilities and events that would maximize both military and morale effects on German resistance. The planning for these follow-up operations revealed how significantly the Berlin raid had influenced British strategic thinking. The success of small-scale, high-speed operations had demonstrated alternatives to massive bombing campaigns that could achieve strategic objectives with fewer resources and reduced losses. This realization would influence British air strategy for the remainder of the war. German strategic planners, meanwhile, faced the uncomfortable task of restructuring their defensive priorities to address a threat they had not anticipated. The resources required to improve defenses against high-speed bombers competed with other critical military needs, forcing difficult decisions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. The Berlin raid had also influenced German aircraft development priorities, with increased emphasis placed on high-altitude interceptors and radar-guided fighter systems. However, these development programs required time and resources that Germany was increasingly unable to spare, highlighting the strategic disadvantages of fighting a multi-front war against opponents with crass, superior industrial capacity. The technical innovations demonstrated by the Mosquito's success over Berlin would continue to influence aviation development long after the war ended. The integration of speed, stealth, and precision that characterized the aircraft represented a new paradigm in military aviation that would shape fighter and bomber design for generations to come. The wooden construction technique that had initially seemed primitive to German observers was now recognized as a sophisticated engineering solution that achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. The use of non-strategic materials, reduced radar signature, and simplified manufacturing processes demonstrated advantages that would be studied and emulated by aircraft designers worldwide. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that powered the Mosquito also represented a significant achievement in powerplant technology, demonstrating reliability and performance characteristics that set new standards for aircraft engines. The lessons learned from Merlin development would influence British engine design throughout the jet age and beyond. For the crews who had flown the Berlin mission, the success of their operation validated months of intensive training and preparation. Squadron Leader Pickard and his fellow aircrew had demonstrated that skilled pilots operating advanced aircraft could achieve results that would have been impossible using conventional bombers and tactics. The personal impact on these airmen was profound, though they typically downplayed their achievements in the understated manner characteristic of RAF culture. They had proven that precision, courage, and technical excellence could overcome seemingly impossible odds, striking at the heart of enemy territory with impunity and returning home to fight another day. The intelligence gathered during and after the Berlin raid provided valuable insights into German defensive capabilities and limitations that would influence Allied operations throughout the remainder of the war. The German reaction to the attack revealed patterns of command and control that could be exploited in future operations. While technical intelligence about German radar and fighter capabilities helped British planners develop increasingly effective penetration tactics, the success of the Berlin operation also validated the investment in specialized navigation and bombing equipment that made precision attacks possible. The combination of advanced instruments and highly trained aircrew had achieved accuracy levels that exceeded pre-war expectations, demonstrating the potential for surgical strikes against critical targets. The broader strategic implications of the raid continued to unfold throughout 1943 and into 1944, as both sides adapted their strategies to address the lessons learned. The British developed increasingly sophisticated precision bombing campaigns that built on the Mosquito's proven capabilities, while the Germans struggled to restructure their defenses to address threats they had not anticipated. The psychological warfare dimension of the Berlin raid proved to have lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate impact of the bombs themselves. The demonstration that nowhere in the Reich was safe from Allied attack undermined German civilian morale in ways that massive bombing campaigns had not achieved, showing that sometimes precision could be more effective than raw destructive power. The legacy of that remarkable January morning when wooden British aircraft penetrated the heart of Nazi Germany would influence military aviation and strategic thinking for decades to come. But for the men who planned and executed the mission, it represented something simpler and more profound, proof that courage, skill, and innovative thinking could triumph over seemingly impossible odds in service of freedom and justice. The ripple effects of the Berlin raid extended into unexpected corners of the war effort, influencing everything from industrial policy to diplomatic negotiations. In neutral countries across Europe, military attachés and intelligence officers carefully studied reports of the Mosquito's performance, recognizing that the balance of air power was shifting in ways that would affect their own national security calculations. Swedish aircraft manufacturers, maintaining precarious neutrality while supplying both sides with various materials, began quietly investigating whether similar high-speed, wooden aircraft could be developed for their own air force. Switzerland's military leadership was particularly interested in the Mosquito's defensive implications. Surrounded by German-controlled territory, but determined to maintain independence, Swiss planners recognized that high-speed, hard-to-detect aircraft might offer their small air force capabilities that could deter invasion while avoiding the massive resource commitments required for conventional air defenses. Secret negotiations began with British representatives about potential technology transfer, though these discussions would remain carefully hidden from German intelligence. The success over Berlin also influenced Soviet strategic thinking, though Stalin's regime was characteristically secretive about their assessments. Soviet aviation designers had been developing their own high-speed bomber concepts, but the Mosquito's proven combat effectiveness provided validation for design philosophies that emphasized speed over armor. The wooden construction technique was particularly intriguing to Soviet engineers, who faced severe shortages of aluminum and other strategic metals. Soviet intelligence networks in Britain worked diligently to gather technical information about the Mosquito, though their efforts were hampered by British security measures and the complex nature of the aircraft's wooden construction techniques. The specialized carpentry skills required to build Mosquito airframes represented a manufacturing challenge that would be difficult to replicate quickly in Soviet factories, but the strategic advantages were obvious enough to justify intensive study. Back in Germany, the psychological impact of the Berlin raid continued to reverberate through civilian society in ways that Nazi propaganda could not entirely suppress. Workers in aircraft factories found themselves asking uncomfortable questions about German technical superiority, while air raid wardens in major cities began pressing for improved early warning systems and shelter preparations. The myth of invulnerable German airspace had been shattered, and no amount of official denial could restore the confidence that had been lost. German aircraft workers, many of whom were skilled engineers and technicians, understood the technical implications of the Mosquito's success better than most civilians. They recognized that British engineers had achieved something remarkable, and this recognition undermined Nazi claims about German technological supremacy. Factory productivity began to show subtle signs of declining morale, as workers questioned whether their efforts were contributing to weapon systems that could compete effectively with Allied innovations. The ripple effects extended to German university research programs, where academic engineers and scientists found themselves reassessing fundamental assumptions about aircraft design and material science. The use of wood in high-performance aircraft challenged conventional wisdom about material properties and structural engineering, forcing a reevaluation of research priorities and development programs. Professor Ludwig Prandtl, the father of modern aerodynamics and director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Flow Research, privately admitted to colleagues that the British had achieved something his own team had not thought possible. Prandtl's research had focused primarily on optimizing metal aircraft structures, but the Mosquito's success suggested that alternative approaches might offer unexpected advantages. The German academic community's response to the Mosquito revealed the intellectual isolation that Nazi ideology had imposed on scientific research. Years of emphasis on German superiority and dismissal of foreign innovations had created blind spots in technological development that were now becoming apparent. The wooden aircraft the German experts had initially scorned represented sophisticated engineering solutions that their own research programs had overlooked. Meanwhile, in occupied territories, the psychological impact of the Berlin raid was amplifying resistance activities in unexpected ways. Dutch resistance networks, operating under increasingly harsh German repression, found that news of British bombers over Berlin provided a powerful recruiting tool. Young men who might otherwise have remained passive were inspired to join underground networks by evidence that the German war machine was not invincible. The Dutch resistance leader Gerrit van der Veen noted in his coded communications to London that German occupation forces seemed noticeably more paranoid after the Berlin raid, implementing additional security measures that ironically made their presence more obvious to the civilian population. The psychological impact of demonstrating German vulnerability had created a feedback loop that amplified resistance effectiveness. Similar patterns emerged throughout occupied Europe as resistance movements capitalized on the psychological impact of the Berlin bombing. In Norway, sabotage operations against German installations increased significantly in the weeks following the raid, while Belgian resistance networks reported improved cooperation from civilians who had previously been reluctant to provide assistance. The success of the Mosquito over Berlin also influenced Allied planning for the eventual invasion of Europe. Strategic planners recognized that precision bombing capabilities could be used to support ground operations in ways that massive strategic bombing campaigns could not achieve. The ability to strike specific targets with minimal collateral damage opened new possibilities for coordinating air and ground operations. General Dwight Eisenhower, who would eventually command the D-Day invasion, was briefed extensively about Mosquito capabilities and their potential applications in support of amphibious operations. The aircraft's versatility and precision made it ideal for attacking specific tactical targets like bridges, communication centers, and command posts that would be critical to invasion success. British planners began developing specialized tactics for using Mosquitoes in support of ground operations, recognizing that their speed and accuracy could provide capabilities that conventional bombers could not match. These tactical innovations would prove crucial during the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaigns across Western Europe. The intelligence value of the Berlin raid also proved significant, as British codebreakers and signals intelligence specialists analyzed German communications about the attack. The German response revealed command structures, communication procedures, and defensive priorities that provided valuable insights into Luftwaffe organization and capabilities. The increased German communications traffic generated by the raid provided opportunities for British cryptographers to break additional German codes and cipher systems. The confusion and urgent consultations that followed the bombing created more signals traffic than usual, giving codebreakers additional material to work with and new insights into German military procedures. These intelligence insights influenced broader Allied strategy as planners gained better understanding of German defensive capabilities and limitations. The Berlin raid had essentially forced the Germans to reveal their hand, showing how they responded to unexpected threats and exposing weaknesses in their command and control systems. The technical intelligence gathered from the raid also provided valuable information about German radar capabilities and limitations. The fact that wooden aircraft could penetrate German air defenses suggested vulnerabilities that could be exploited in other operations, leading to development of specialized tactics and equipment for suppressing breaths. Enemy radar systems. British electronic warfare specialists began intensive studies of how the Mosquito's wooden construction affected radar detection, laying groundwork for future stealth aircraft development. The principles discovered during this research would influence aircraft design concepts that wouldn't reach fruition until decades after the war ended. The manufacturing implications of the Mosquito's success also influenced British industrial planning throughout 1943 and beyond. The aircraft's wooden construction had initially been seen as a stopgap measure to conserve strategic metals, but its combat effectiveness validated wood as a legitimate structural material for high performance. Aircraft. British aircraft manufacturers began investigating expanded use of wooden construction techniques in other aircraft types, though the specialized carpentry skills required limited the speed at which production could be expanded. The success of the Mosquito demonstrated that alternative materials could achieve performance levels comparable to conventional metal construction, but the manufacturing techniques required different industrial infrastructure and worker training. The labor implications were particularly significant, as British industry faced severe manpower shortages throughout the war period. Wooden aircraft construction required skilled carpenters and woodworkers, whose talents were in high demand for other war production activities. Balancing these competing priorities required careful planning and resource allocation at the highest levels of government. De Havilland's engineering team faced the challenge of scaling up production while maintaining the precise manufacturing standards required for the Mosquito's wooden components. The aircraft's performance depended critically on maintaining exact tolerances and surface finishes, requirements that were difficult to achieve using mass production techniques. The company's solution involved establishing specialized training programs that taught traditional woodworking craftsmen the precision techniques required for aircraft construction. This approach created a unique industrial capability that combined ancient carpentry skills with modern engineering requirements, producing aircraft that met the most demanding performance specifications. The success of these manufacturing techniques influenced post-war aircraft development, as designers recognized that alternative materials and construction methods could offer advantages over conventional approaches. The lessons learned from Mosquito production would influence composite material development and advanced manufacturing techniques that became standard in later decades. The Berlin raid also had significant implications for pilot training and operational procedures throughout the Royal Air Force. The success of Pickard's crews demonstrated that intensive training and careful mission planning could achieve results that seemed impossible using conventional tactics and procedures. RAF training establishments began developing specialized curricula for high-speed, low-level operations that built on lessons learned from the Berlin mission. These programs emphasized precision navigation, formation flying in hostile airspace, and rapid target identification and engagement techniques that would be crucial for future precision bombing operations. The psychological aspects of operating alone or in small formations deep in enemy territory required different mental preparation than conventional bomber operations. Aircrew had to develop confidence in their aircraft and their own abilities that went beyond normal training requirements, understanding that their survival depended entirely on speed, stealth, and precision rather than defensive armament or formation protection. These training innovations influenced RAF doctrine throughout the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. The concepts of precision attack and surgical strikes that were validated over Berlin became standard elements of Air Force planning, influencing everything from aircraft procurement to operational procedures. The success of the Berlin operation also validated British investment in advanced navigation and bombing equipment that made precision attacks possible. The combination of sophisticated instruments and highly trained aircrew had achieved accuracy levels that exceeded pre-war expectations, demonstrating the potential for technological solutions to enhance human capabilities. British electronics manufacturers began intensive development programs aimed at further improving navigation and bombing accuracy, recognizing that precision weapons could be more effective than massive bombardment in many situations. These technological developments would influence military electronics for decades after the war ended. The integration of advanced electronics with aircraft systems demonstrated during the Mosquito program laid groundwork for modern avionics development. The lessons learned about human-machine interaction and system integration would influence aircraft design throughout the jet age and beyond. As spring turned to summer in 1943, the full strategic implications of the Berlin raid continued to unfold across multiple theaters of the war. The demonstration that precision attacks could achieve strategic objectives with minimal resources influenced Allied planning in the Pacific, Mediterranean, and Eastern European theaters as commanders recognized new possibilities for coordinating air and ground operations. The psychological warfare aspects of the raid proved to have lasting effects but extended far beyond Germany itself. Axis allies like Italy, Romania, and Hungary began questioning German promises about air defense capabilities, while neutral countries reconsidered their assessments of likely war outcomes based on evidence of shifting technological and operational advantages. The success over Berlin had demonstrated that the war was entering a new phase, characterized by rapid technological development and innovative operational concepts that challenged traditional military balls. Thinking. The wooden aircraft that had been dismissed as primitive by German experts represented a fundamental shift in aviation technology that would influence aircraft development for generations to come. For the aircrew who had flown the mission, the success over Berlin represented validation of months of intensive training and preparation, but it also marked the beginning of an operational tempo that would test their skills and endurance throughout the remainder of the war. The techniques and procedures developed for the Berlin raid would be refined and expanded as Mosquito squadrons conducted increasingly ambitious operations against targets throughout occupied Europe. The legacy of that remarkable January morning would continue to influence military aviation and strategic thinking long after the war ended. But for the men who had planned and executed the mission, it represented something even more significant. Proof that determination, innovation, and courage could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles in the fight for freedom and justice. The wooden wonder had struck at the heart of Nazi power and returned home safely, carrying with it the hopes and aspirations of free peoples everywhere who looked to the skies for deliverance from tyranny.